Hey everyone, welcome to another video. This is Jared here from CoderComplete, and in my last video I gave an overview of a lot of the different CSS concepts and properties that are useful in making your website responsive. In this video I actually want to apply those properties to a real project where I'm cloning the front end of Airbnb. So I'm going to share my screen and I will show you what I have so far. So right now, if you look at the difference between these two, I obviously didn't get every minor detail, but they look generally similar. And now when I drag the screen out, this is how Airbnb will change, but my app currently doesn't change at all. So this is very normal for beginners. They make the app look good on their screen. So typically they'll start out in the desktop, make it look good on the desktop or laptop screen, but it won't look good as it shrinks. But I decided to reproduce the mobile view first, and then, now I'll have to deal with what we do when the screen gets larger. So what we're going to do is I'm going to target one by one different parts of the UI and make them responsive. So the first thing I want to do is this input bar here, and I just want to do the size. So notice that the input bar shrinks, grows. Now the input bar changes completely at a certain point, but I'm not going to deal with that just yet. I just want to deal with the actual width of the input bar. And what I'm noticing is at a certain point, it's growing. And then as I keep dragging out the screen, it stops growing. It stays at a maximum size. So that's a hint to use max width. And I do want to grab the actual size of this input bar at this point in time. So I will look for this or this. So by clicking on this guy, I can see the exact width of the input bar at this point in time, which appears to be its maximum width. And I see 850 pixels. So that is the measurement I'm going to use for max width. So basically, my input here at the moment has, if you notice what I did, in my header, I have a form with inside of which I have an image of a magnifying glass and an input, and then an image filter over here. So what I want to do is deal with the form slash the input. The form has an ID of search container, so I'm going to look for that. And right now you can see that the width I've hard coded to be 300 pixels. So it looks good when the screen is exactly about this size. But it, because we've hard coded in pixels, it won't look good when we drag the screen out. So instead, why don't we try something like percentages and see what we get? So what if we chose, let's say, 70%? So 70% looks pretty good, right? Now let's start dragging this out and let's see. Okay, so the input bar still looks okay, it's not ideal. Still looks okay, but what if we get this big? Then the input bar looks too big, right? It looks kind of weird. So that's a design decision at a certain point to bring on a max width. So we saw that max width is about 850 pixels, so now let's see how it looks. So now it grows. And let's see what size it's at the moment. You can go to the form, look at computed size. We see 850. So when I close this, the input bar is basically at 850 pixels now. So if I close this, the screen technically becomes even bigger because we have this space now, and the input bar should not appear to grow anymore. And as you can see, it stayed the same size. So the max width has worked. And then, we could always tweak our design to have a smaller or bigger max width, but that's the idea of it. Now, I also noticed that the input bar plus this filter icon here are not centered within this row, right? Like it doesn't look good that it's not directly in the middle, whereas Airbnb's input bar is always in the middle, right? Now the filter disappears at a certain point, this guy, but we're not going to deal with that just yet. So let's get just these guys to be centered, basically. So how do you center these guys in the screen? Well, there's many ways, but the way I like to use is flex because it allows you to easily position elements that are next to each other or on top of each other. Basically, when you're dealing with flex, you're dealing with one dimension, X direction or Y direction. In this case, these guys are organized in the X direction. So to accomplish this, I can make my header display flex, which ensures that the form and the image are going to be in a row with each other because with flex, the flex direction is by default row. And then I can justify content center. And now, no matter how big the screen is, these two guys will always be centered on any screen size. I actually think that the input bar is too big. There are different proportions somehow with Airbnb and my guy, so I'm going to actually reduce the max width. Okay, so that looks better. So now everything's centered. So actually centering things with Flex is a responsive idea as well because it basically allows you to make a design decision for any size of the screen, so it will always look good. Okay, so that is the input bar. Now I want to actually scroll to the bottom and deal with the footer sections because they're easier than I want to talk about the grid system here, but on its own, and also there's a lot that changes when the screen changes from this view to this view up here. So I want to deal with all that last. And we can use some of the principles we've applied to the easier things when we do that one. So let's look at the footer here. As you can see, they have this guy, they have stuff here, they have this, then they have a few sections, section, and then this thing down here. I'm actually going to open my DevTools because it should be even different looking. Okay, so basically we're going to have to go from this to this, where the only things that really changed is that these three that were previously different sections are now in the same section next to each other. And also the bottom here looks different, right? So we're going to achieve that. And I have actually captured images of this so I don't have to look back at the UI a lot. So as you can see, I have images of the footer sections, small screen looks like this, and this as well. And then big screen looks like this. So you can see that these sections have been roped into each other. Also the very bottom footer section, you can see on a small screen it looks like this, medium screen looks like this, big screen looks like this. So we're going to achieve that now. So let's go down to my footer. Let's see what we have so far. I'm calling this guy footer suggestions. And then each one of these is a suggestion. Although it doesn't look very good. I noticed that in the design, these are what I'm calling the suggestions, this part. And the name is supposed to be above the, the bold text is supposed to be above the gray text. But for some reason in mine, it's not that way right now. So let's first solve that really quick. And for each footer suggestion, I see I have a class called footer suggestion with a b and then a span. And all I have to do is grab my footer suggestion class, and what I can do is use display flex direction column, and then they'll go on top of each other. Now we do actually have to do more with this section because if you look at the design, they kind of displayed in more of a grid type system. So display grid could be used in order to achieve something like that. It's doable with flex too. So let's just do it with flex while we're here. And I think I could change it. Oh, sorry, flex direction column is good for the footer suggestion. However, for the footer suggestions, which is like the container for the footer suggestions, maybe I'll call it footer suggestion container instead, because I like that better. And for this guy, we can also make this display flex, and that's going to put them all in a row with each other. And then we can do flex wrap, and what that will do is whenever in a row they have gone too far, it will wrap and put it on the next line. And finally, I just need to space them out more so I can use gap, and that will create a gap between all of them. I think that that is adequate. Okay, so that's the very top section of the footer. Looks good now. Now let's deal with the next three sections, which are supposed to move into a row with each other and be part of the same section, right? At the moment, the three different sections, they all should become one section. So how are we going to achieve that? What I notice is that all three are organized in a column at the moment. We can deal with these lines later, but these three sections are basically in a column, and the goal is to move them into a row, right? So what I'd want to do is simply, what we can do is change the flex direction from column to row. So what I want to do is actually wrap these three footer sections in another div that I'm going to put flex on, basically, so that these three divs, these three sections become flex items, and I can organize them in a column and then a row pretty easily. So I'm going to call this, let's call it footer main sections. I don't know. I can't think of anything better right now. And I'm going to wrap all three of those sections in there. And now my footer main sections is going to be display flex. And by default, flex direction is row, so they all kind of move into a row with each other. But I can change the flex direction easily to back to column, and now they're back in their column format. Now, it's the first time we can use a breakpoint. We have to discern what point the UI will change in Airbnb such that they now are in a row. Yep, right there. 950. So we're going to set our first breakpoint now, and we'll say at media screen and min width 950 pixels. Our footer main sections, let me call it main sections container. So it contains the main sections. And I will change its flex direction to row. Okay, so now let's see how we do. As you can see, they're in a column, then we get to 950, then they go into a row. So now we have to deal with spacing them out a bit. So we have a flex property at our disposal called justify content space between. And what this was going to do now is space them all out equally in our row. So basically the row is the footer main sections container, which is this whole section, and then each item is the footer section itself. So this guy, and this guy. We can look at the HTML as well, and we see, okay, footer main section containers, all that, then it is equally spacing between each other these three footer sections. Okay, now the last thing we have to do is, if you notice in our design, the text is sort of on the left. Like this takes up 1/3 of the size, this takes up 1/3 of the size, this takes up 1/3 of the size, and the text is all on the left-hand side. So the problem at the moment is that each of these footer sections are only as wide as the text inside of them. So a way to fix this is actually to have each of these three footer sections take up more space. They should each take up 1/3 of the space inside the row. So the way to give them all equal spacing is actually, you could use percentage, I suppose, but I'm going to use another flex property. And this time, what I'm going to target is the footer sections inside the footer main sections container, so these three guys, and the property I'm going to use is called flex1. And now what that has done, it has made each of these footer sections 1/3 of the footer main section container width. Now, how did that work? What is flex1? Flex1 just means that each of these guys should grow at the same rate. They all grow or shrink. They all grow. So right now, this guy is 374.34 pixels wide. This one is, and this one is. And then as the screen grows, so do they. They all grow at the same rate. So they'll always be the same width. 396, 396, 396. So that's what flex1 does. And now, as you can see, because these three guys are all technically spaced in between each other, right? Because what we're actually spacing between each other when we say justify content space between on our footer main sections container is the three footer sections. And if each footer section takes up 1/3 of the space of the footer main sections container, then technically all three are spaced equally between each other, aren't they? And by default, inside a div with no other styling otherwise, all the content will just begin on the left side of it. So that's why all the text is now on the left side of each of these footer sections. So now it looks proper. This is actually the exact UI that we want for Airbnb. Right now, on the small screen, they're stacked on top of each other. When we grow the screen, they become next to each other. So that handles this section here. And then the last footer section we have to deal with is the guy down here. Okay, so I just added this bottom line in here because I forgot to add the HTML and CSS to it before, but you'll see that it is not responsive, so it always looks the same no matter how big the screen gets. But if we look at our designs, which I took screenshots of, we got the small design just fine. I ignored the globe, I ignored the blue thing, but otherwise it looks relatively the same. And then medium screen changes a bit, and then big screen changes more. So let's look at these and analyze them. So for a medium screen, we are supposed to have this stuff on top. So same structure, this on top, then this, except everything's centered. And also we have these social media icons here. And then for a big screen, it changes a lot. We have on the very left the 2024 Airbnb copyright thing. Then we have all these guys, and then we have the English USD on the right. So we're going to have to figure out how to move this from the top over to the right, and this from the middle and bottom over to the left from each other. Left, left, and then right. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's just do one thing at a time. So we'll do a medium screen first. So the idea is to get this on top of this and this. And it already is, but we'll just have to style it slightly differently to center everything. Okay, so let's look at what we have so far. So we have a div in our at the end of our footer called footer section last footer last info. And then in there we have a paragraph for this guy, a paragraph for this line, and then for this line I did a little bit of custom stuff, wrapping every of the one of these guys in a span with a class so that I could add this period thing in between each one. So let's work on getting all this to be defined in a column with flex, because then flex makes it easy to put these guys in a column and then center them. So at the moment, let's see what we have on the container for all those, which is again footer section, footer last info. So footer last info, I don't see any styles directly on footer last info yet. So let me add display flex, flex direction column, and I wouldn't expect things to change. Okay, good. Now let's see what happens when I do align items center. Okay, that centers everything. So we're not supposed to have line item center initially, right? For small screens, the text is supposed to be on the left, as we can see in our image there. But when we reach a certain screen width, we'd want that to change. So let's look at Airbnb, see when it actually changes. Okay, so it's already in that medium screen size, and it changes, let's see, down here now. Still the medium size that we would want. And okay, so this is a small size. So it's right around this big. Okay, so small size, small format, and then boom, maybe that will do it. So it should be in the mediums format now. Still medium format. So I noticed in that the UI changes a lot at 744 pixels, so that will be our breakpoint. So we'll basically do I've just kept that align item setter. So basically what we're going to do is another media query at 744 pixels and up. So basically it's up to 743 pixels. The UI looks similar down there in the footer. And then at 744 it changes. So at 744 we want to change our footer last info to align items center. And I think that should do it. So we're in the small guy. We're going to get up to 744 pixels. Then all of a sudden it's centered as it's supposed to be. I'll deal with the social media icons when we've gotten the general layout done first. So at the moment it looks good now. Okay, so now we want to do the big screen and make that happen. So what's going to happen is these two guys are supposed to be on the left-hand side. This guy's supposed to be on the top. So how are we going to achieve that? At the moment, they're in like a column format, but this looks more like a row, but the order looks different, right? So I'm going to talk you through my thought process for how we can accomplish this with flex and flex direction and things like that. So at the moment, we have a column, each item separate, like our div is footer last info. class footer last info. Class footer last info div has 3 children, a paragraph, and a div. This paragraph is supposed to go on the right. So if we were to just change footer last info to flex direction row, then we would see this on the left, then this next to it, and then this guy next to that. So it'd go this, then this, left to right. But we want this guy on the other side. So what we can actually do is combine these two guys, because these guys are supposed to be next to each other left to right. And instead of having 3 children of footer last info, we'll have 2. And as far as a column right now that we're looking at is concerned, that's fine, right? This guy and the div that will surround these two will be in a column, and that's okay. So let's sort that out first. So I'll just show you kind of what I mean. It's hard to really describe without showing it. So we'll call it, for lack of a better word, footer last info last 2 lines. And so that's going to wrap around the last 2 lines. And now we still have the column sorted, right? Still looks okay, even on a smaller screen. In fact, on a smaller screen it looks proper because the text is supposed to be on the left-hand side. But on a bigger screen, this guy should be centered, right? So what we're looking at so far is our footer last info is display flex direction column. So this paragraph here and this div here are both in a column, which makes sense because this and now this div here surrounds all of this. So this is above this. So it's in a column. That's working properly. Not only that, but on here we applied the idea that the items should be centered. And technically this is centered and this guy is centered as well. Let me just open up DevTools to really illustrate this. This is our outer div, right? And it's flex direction column and aligning everything in the middle. So this guy is in the middle. Also this div, if you look at it, it surrounds this and this, 2 separate things, but this is centered on the screen, right? You can see that. Now I have to add display flex to this guy to also arrange this paragraph and this div in a column inside of here. By default, they already are because P and divs are both display block by default, which means again that they take up the full width of their container. But we will have to center everything as well. In fact, I can center this as well by just using text align center on this paragraph. So maybe I'll just do that to keep things extra simple. And again, we're only going to want to do that at the breakpoint. So before that, our paragraph should be aligned on the left, right? So it should be aligned on the left when we have a really small screen. Should look like this. But at the breakpoint, that's when this text should now be aligned in the middle. So I'm going to identify that element. Actually gave it, no I didn't. So yeah, I gave it a class. So I'm going to say from 744 pixels and up, then this guy I'm going to text align center. And now the text align is centered. So the text align is going to be left, and then when we hit 744, it does text align center. And that will continue to do so as the screen increases in size. Okay, so now we've achieved the same design, but now we have wrapped these 2 bottom guys inside of a div that we can now that will now allow us to separate the footer last info children differently, because I want this English USD thing on the right and this whole chunk on the left, and inside of this chunk I actually want them to be in a row instead of in a column. So actually that is another reason I was going to use flex on this guy. Did I use flex already? No, I haven't styled it yet. So basically, I'm going to remove this text align center idea because I'm going to achieve the same thing with flex. So basically, I'm going to make display flex the container around these 2 lines, and then flex direction column. And now we've achieved the same thing. And what we're going to do at 744 pixels and up is grab it again and change its flex to, align item center, just like we did with the footer last info. And now when we reach 743 pixels, now everything's aligned in the middle in this div that surrounds just these 2 guys. So now what I'm going to do is the big screen. So to get a big screen, the big screen look, what I want to do is move this guy to the right and move this div to the left first. So what I'm actually going to do, and also I need to identify the breakpoint for a big screen. So let's look at the UI again. We're at the middle, we're at this UI, and then eventually it's going to spread out onto one line. So we have to notice at what point that is. Let's just say 1100 to make it cleaner. So we'll say we need to set another breakpoint at 1100 px. And at this point in time, what we want to do is change footer last info to a row. So I'm going to do everything one by one. So instead of flex direction column, it's going to be now flex direction row. So let's see how that looks in our design. So we get to 1100 pixels. Now everything's in a row. It looks pretty ugly, but we also want a space between, right? Justify content, space between. And now we have English USD on the left and the rest of the stuff on the right. But we actually want the reverse of that, don't we? We want English USD blah, blah, blah on the right and this on the left. So what we can actually do is change our flex direction from row to row reverse. And it basically does the row, but does the opposite order. And so now we've gotten this in the proper format, except these two guys we need to sort out now as well, because these are currently in a column and we want those two guys to be in a row so that they're next to each other. And the container for that is our footer last info last two lines. And now we can make them flex direction row. Okay, so now we're pretty close. What I want to do is just add one or more of these dots to separate terms from all this stuff. So I can do that with saying, let me look at what I did before. So I had footer last info terms. So basically footer last info terms is the span surrounding each of these four guys down here. And what I'm saying right now is that after each one, there should be a dot, except the last one, there should be no dot. That's kind of what I'm doing here. And so what I want to do is actually, for the first one, add one dot before. So I'm going to grab this code. I'm going to go all the way down to when we're dealing with this. And we're going to use before instead of after. And I'm going to have to change the margins most likely. Let's see. So now, actually, it looks good already. So I added the dot. Okay, it looks a little weird actually. Oh, because I need the first child only. So basically before the first child, where the children I'm talking about are each of these guys, so just before the first one, add a period. Now it looks like as it's supposed to. See? So there we go. That is how you make the bottom responsive, because we've gone from this look to this look to this look. I just want to do the social media buttons because what I want to show you is how you can make something appear or disappear, right? Because at the moment you don't see them, and then by the medium screen you do. So what I'm going to do is basically just put them in my HTML next to here. So I will actually add some stuff in here as well. And I'll give a span. Inside this span, I will add my three images, where each image will be one of the social media icons. And each source will be images slash, and then I need FB, I need like Twitter, and I forget what the other one is, IG. So now I have those three images, and now they're next to this guy, and I'll give my class, my span a class of social media icons. And so I can grab that class somewhere in my styles. Let's do it down here for now and say width 16px, height 16px. I want the image. Okay, that looks better. They're probably bigger though in the real design, so let's do 20. Looks good enough. And so what I want to do is make these not visible at the moment, but visible after a certain point. So I'm going to start them out at display none. And then when we reach 744 pixels and up, I'm going to give the social media icons display inline because they're all next to each other. So basically we're going to look at a small screen and they're not there. And then once we get to 744 pixels, boom, they appear and they're always there after that. So that's how you make that happen. And now we are on to the images grid here. And the header stuff, I'm actually going to save for another video because I want you to try to apply a lot of the principles that we just talked about in order to achieve this on your own before I come out with the solution for this part. So what I'm going to do is first show you how to do this using Flex, creating this grid type system here. But I will show you that there's kind of a limitation to using Flex and then that being a case for using grid instead. So I want to show you the difference and why grid can be useful. So first let's go over, I'm going to shrink everything that we've done. So we're done with the footer now. And we're going to open the card container. And inside the card container, let's see what we have so far. Card container. So no styling on the card container yet. I basically just put everything on new lines because divs are display blocks, so everything's going to be on a new line. So at the moment I have like 6 cards or so, and as the screen grows and shrinks, it should change how many cards are on the same line. So how do we do that? Well, what I want to do is make our card container display flex, and then have each card be a flex item. So I'm going to, for my card container, make it display flex. And that by default is flex direction row. So it puts all of my cards in a row and it appears to have squished them all together to fit the one row. But if I allow a flex wrap, that means that if there's too many for one line, they'll go on to the next line. So now if I get to this size, then the next ones go to the next line. So that's looking better. One issue is when we're at something like this, right? It looks bad because there's all this space here while we're waiting for the next card to fit, right? Whereas if you look at Airbnb, there's only a tiny bit of margin as and the images grow to keep fitting that, and only when there's enough space for a third, then it makes room for that. So that is what we want to achieve basically. So what I'll have to do is set some properties on these cards so that they'll change size slightly as I grow and shrink the screen. So what I can do is for each card use this property called flex. And so flex 1 on a card, as we saw before, will make each card the same, stretch the same amount. The problem is that we're now back to the issue of them all being on the same row. So we have something called, so the flex is a shorthand for 3 different properties. There's flex grow, flex shrink, and keep in mind I'm doing this on the flex item, not on the flex container. The card container is the flex container where I said display flex, but each card is a child of the card container, so they're therefore flex items. And on flex items, you can use flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis, or you can use flex and specify values for each of them in the same line. So that's what flex is. Flex grow describes how the flex item will grow in relation to the others. So if every flex item had the same flex grow amount, they'll all grow at the same rate. Same with flex shrink. They'll all shrink at the same rate as the screen shrinks. Flex basis is basically defining an initial size or like a minimum size that the cards can be. So basically all the cards will shrink as much as possible to fit the screen and stay on the same line. But if we set a flex basis like an initial or default beginning size, then they will not continue to shrink past 200 pixels. So now it looks better, but the images are getting cut off, kind of weird because I've specified an exact width for these images. So instead of that, I can just choose to maintain an aspect ratio, let's say, so that the images will always be at minimum 200 pixels by 200 pixels. Because I just want to show you that these three guys can be put onto one line with flex. So instead of flex grow basis shrink, I do this. So now you're starting to see the issue with flex when you're dealing with grid or other like two-dimensional things, where not only do we care about the x-axis but the y-axis and maintaining a similar look between everything. Because at the moment the properties are all still holding true. Each card will be at a minimum 200 pixels, but it can be bigger, right? And we can't, the thing is, these images are supposed to be able to scale a little bit, right? So that they'll always stretch to fit the screen without there being too much of a gap on either side of all of the images. So we could set a max width, let's say on the card, we can set a max width. Let's just try 300 pixels to see. But it still looks weird, right? Because the guys down here are bigger because they're able to stretch more. So with grid, we have a really easy way of controlling the entire grid of things. So we're going to use that instead. So I'm going to take out anything flex related and instead use display grid on the card container. And I'm not an expert in grid, but you can always Google what you're looking for specifically with grid, or ChatGPT it or whatever. And it's really easy. I just needed this one property and I was able to make it work. So I'll just add that in there. And now look that in my grid, even if there's less items on the next line, notice that all the items are the same size. So basically what this line is doing, I'm going to reference ChatGPT for the best explanation. So I just said explain this line. And what it's saying is that grid template columns is the property for defining how many columns your grid should have and the width of each column. So obviously we're able to make it variable based on how much space there is. So what we're doing essentially is we're automatically telling the browser to insert as many columns as we can fit into the container, where the container is what we put display grid on. So we put display grid on the card container, which is our main, and the main is the full width of the screen, right? So we are saying fit as many columns as possible into the width of the screen. And the number of columns will depend on the container's width and the minimum size of each column. So the next part is how we define that. So min-max is basically saying at a minimum, our columns can be 200 pixels, which means what we did before, where each image at a minimum could be, or each card at a minimum could be 200 pixels in width. And then 1FR stands for one fractional unit. Fractional unit is a grid-related unit. And basically, it's a similar idea as doing like flex 1. So basically, what we're saying with min-max 201 FR is we're saying that each column can be at a minimum 200 pixels. And if there is more space in the row, but not enough to fit another column, then space each column equally. So basically, one fractional unit for each column will mean each column takes up the same amount of space in the width of the container. So by my shaky explanation, you can see that I'm not a grid expert, and so it is something that you can look into on your own if you'd like, but you can also take from that you don't need to be an absolute expert in it to make any UI you need. You can just use Flex for almost everything and then use Grid occasionally when you need it, when you need something in a grid type format. Because I can achieve almost anything with just Flex, and except when I get into this grid type of structure, and at that point the display grid becomes easier. And I just look up whatever properties I need and then I'm able to make it happen pretty easily. So that is doing this image grid here. And there's only one section left, and that is the header. And I actually want to challenge you to do the header on your own first. Try your best to apply all the principles that we've learned today. We've gone over max width, we've gone over flex, we've gone over percentages, we've gone over media queries, we've gone over display none, and then display flex or display block or inline to make something disappear then reappear with media queries, things like that. And we've also talked about aspect ratio on the images. So using all of this stuff that we have just learned and given examples to, I want you to try to make Airbnb's header. So what we're going to do is just take a quick look at Airbnb's header. I'll point out different things and I'll suggest in a general sense how to go about it without giving away too much. And then in my next video, I'll show you how I will accomplish the same thing and even talk a little bit about JavaScript and its relation to making this UI responsive in a nice, neat way. So let's take a look at the header. So at the moment, this is like our small screen header that we already have. We have the input, we have the filter icon, and we have these guys. So what happens when we get to 743 pixels or 744 is now we have the Airbnb icon, all this stuff up here. We have this menu here as well, and the input bar is different, and this nav is different. It has these arrows now, and we have this filters button down here, and there's no longer filter button here, and we also have this guy here. So my challenge to you is to make all of this happen. And you'll notice as well that when I drag this out, this guy moves up to the top. So it was previously farther down, and then when the screen increases in size, this menu here goes in the same line as the top line. I actually think that that is the most difficult to achieve. So if I were you, I would do that last and maybe even not do it, because you can watch me do it, and also I'll talk about JavaScript in relation to making that happen. But everything else is pretty easily, not easily, but pretty accomplishable with HTML and CSS alone, and it's reasonable to do so in a real application, I think. So yeah, that's it for this video. I hope you found it useful seeing all these things in a practical application, and stay tuned for the next video.